This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra. Thank you for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast, where we talk about great movies and stories so great they should be movies. Links to learn more about our guest today can be found in the show notes. You can support Beyond the Big Screen on Patreon.com. By joining on Patreon, you help keep Beyond the Big Screen sustainable and get many great benefits. Go to patreon.com/Beyond the Big Screen to learn more and sign up. Find show notes, links to subscribe, and leave Apple Podcast reviews by going to our website, beyondthebigscreen.com. And now, let's go beyond the big screen.
Then another thing that came to mind is oftentimes throughout the movie, they would show just the really crazy outlandish stuff that Nero did. How much historical fact is there to what the real character of Nero is? Is there a more nuance to Nero?
Oh, look, there's definitely some elements of justification here. The artistic storyline and him seeing himself as an artist has probably been overblown a little bit, but he certainly did believe that he was talented, and he did perform for the public from quite a young age, and this has become a feature of his legacy, perhaps more so than it needs to be. Nero is a more nuanced character in our source material than a film like this allows him to be. He has quite a varied career, and it's a history marked with trauma as well. He grows up in a really divided household. The rumors about him having to, or maybe not having to, but being implicated in the poisoning of his brother Britannicus, who's another contender to be emperor. The fact that the marriage with the first wife, Octavia, his stepsister, is also marred by personal trauma and drama and of her eventual execution.
He did order that execution, though. I mean, he could have avoided that trauma if he really wanted to.
He could have. Yeah. He could have. I'm not suggesting that the trauma is just something that happens to him.
Yeah.
And the situation with his mother and what we know about the sort of increasing tensions with his relationship with Agrippina as he gets older, and whether there's something about his character that predisposes him to this, or whether it's the circumstances in which he's trying to really forge his own path, because he does push away his early advisors, and he's generally praised for his early reign. Things take a pretty severe turn after 64, but they're not great before then as well. Things are definitely happening.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, the movie's got like some of the detail right in terms of by the time this movie seems to be taking place, it was getting into the worst years of Nero's reign. He had put on a lot of weight. He had that weird chin beard that Peter Ustinov is sporting. And he was definitely, doing things that traditional Romans might not have approved of, such as, performing. And I mean, I think in a way, what the movie and Sienkiewicz himself was playing off was a lot of the more scandalous, exaggerated stories of Nero that we actually find in the ancient source material itself. I mean, because Nero ends up becoming a bit of a train crash of an emperor, it seems that mostly the negative sort of stock character tyrant material has survived in our ancient source material. And so we have people like Suetonius telling us that when Nero was performing, no one was allowed to leave, even if it was really urgent. So you have this story about a woman even giving birth during one of his performances because she wasn't allowed to leave. And also they do play on certain details, like when before we were talking about Nero looking at the new model of what will be the new Rome and how he was going to call it Neropolis. That's a detail that is preserved in Suetonius as well. That's not just invented for the sake of the movie. Whether Suetonius was exaggerating Nero's character is, I suppose, the thing that we try to figure out, but it's probably a little hard to figure out without enough. I mean, certainly the thing that's interesting about Nero is that even though we do have these sorts of very negative stories about him coming through in Tacitus and Suetonius, after his suicide, there are stories of false Neros popping up and being greeted being welcomed in by some segments of the population, mostly, the people of the empire, the people of Rome. So it seems that Nero probably was just really unpopular with the elite in particular, which you can understand. Because
there does seem to be, a very sort of popular feeling for Nero, even with things like the fire. They particularly get behind Octavia, his first wife. They don't want her to be exiled, and they certainly don't want her to be executed. So that gets them offside. But he does win them back in various ways. And his relief offered in the wake of the fire to the people of the city seems to be a huge positive gesture for getting the people back on side. And all of that is really glossed over as not part of Nero's story in this film. And obviously there's very good strategic and narrative reasons for why you wouldn't want to do that. It obviously creates a far more complex picture of Nero than perhaps is ideal for where this storyline is going. He is not solely terrible, although he obviously does terrible things. But certainly the critique that's coming from the elite can't be discounted. There's a lot of negative tradition that is connected with Nero, and our writing is coming from people who are senatorial members, and they're coming from people who are also trying to offer warnings to their current emperors who they also despise. So there's a whole tension there about who's telling what kind of information to whom and for what purpose. And somewhere in there, the real Nero is mixed up as a grab bag of horrible things. His relationship with Pompeia is not great either, and she also gets a terrible rap in Tacitus precisely because she's the kind of person who seems to be actively involved in politics when, as Dr. Rad was saying, women are not expected to be public and political in this kind of way. So there's a real complexity to the material here.
Yeah, and also I think the fact that in Quo Vadis, they obviously really compress the timeline. So all of this stuff is sort of heaped on top of each other. So we see Nero planning the fire, we see him executing the fire, and then we see the backlash of that, from the people and also from his fellow elites. And then we see him punishing the Christians. And as a result of this, we end up seeing the conspiracy to overthrow him coming about as a result of these actions. Whereas obviously in reality, it was a lot more spaced out, and it wasn't because of the fire or, because of his persecution of the Christians that Nero was overthrown at all. Whilst Tacitus does remark that people felt sorry for the Christians because they were being made a scapegoat, and Nero, punished them incredibly cruelly for supposedly setting this fire in 64. There was obviously a conspiracy, a fairly serious, widespread conspiracy, which is what Petronius historically was caught up in 65, and which had an impact in 66 and 67 as well, in terms of, Nero's reign was really never the same after that. And Nero himself, this is where he really let himself down. In the aftermath of this rather serious conspiracy amongst the senatorial class, Nero takes himself off to Greece and participates in the Olympic Games and that sort of thing, rather than, staying put and actually dealing with the issue. And it's only, a couple of years later, in 68, that you actually get Galba getting involved. It's not as, they obviously want to have a particular kind of cause and effect in this movie, which is not accurate. And I guess, Steve, is someone who, has studied more the Christian side of things, you probably would have noticed that as well.
Yeah, that all seemed, especially when it got towards the ending, it really went quickly. It was almost jarring at the end, like we're at 3 hours, we better get to the end quick.
Hurry, somebody's seen Galba.
Yeah, and they obviously wanted to put in, the death of Peter, and work that in as well, which is not 100% certain as far as I'm aware. But again, Steve, you'd probably know more about that. I think it's a bit of it's not clear exactly for sure how Peter died.
Yeah,
but there is a belief. Yeah,
that him seeing the vision of Jesus outside of Rome and asking, "Lord, where are you going?" Quo Vadis. That's all from that Acts of Peter, which is apocryphal. It's not accepted as in the Bible of any Christian group, but it's a nice story. And there's a lot of stories that come out from that time of where Peter and Paul are at Rome. The other one is the pseudo Clementine novels. And that's another, I think that one is as long as 2 gospels, maybe even 3. And it's just chocked full of great stories.
Wow.
Of Peter and Paul fighting with the Magi, having like a religion battle, a prayer battle against each other.
Wow.
In the forum, and just all sorts of great things like that. But they're all apocryphal.
What do you think is the potential motivation for using these apocryphal stories as the basis for transmitting ideas about Christianity more broadly?
I heard an interesting from a scholar, a biblical scholar. He said that, and it's sort of a new way of thinking it, that all of these apocryphal accounts, there's a really popular one, the infancy gospel of James. They're sort of a early Christian fan fiction. The people wanted more. In the canonical gospels, you don't get a great story of Jesus's early life. I mean, everything starts in his 33rd year. He's in his mid-30s, mid-career. And people wanted to know the after story as well. And they don't, like in the book of Acts and in Paul's writings, you don't get a great storyline. You're not getting a narrative of what happened afterwards. So these were ways for people to continue the story and enjoy the story more.
Interesting. Yeah. And I think, as I say, I think in this particular version, it has a lot to do, as I said before, with, what was happening for Sienkowitz in his particular context and with the church in particular. And it's really interesting, actually, that they chose to make Lydia's adoptive father, the general, they chose to make him Christian along with Lydia and his wife in this particular version, but that's not always the case. I think in the novel, it's actually just his wife that's a Christian, and she doesn't even dare to raise they actually have another child. She doesn't dare to raise their child as a Christian because her husband isn't Christian. Whereas in this particular movie, they make him not only Christian, but they also make him the one to denounce Nero from his cross. And, call him out and tell the mob, what's really going on, in that, the Christians weren't responsible for lighting the fire, that Nero is playing them, and all that kind of thing.
And that's really the standard story, but fast forwarded about 300 years in the Constantinian time and a little bit before, it was really amongst the aristocratic families. It was usually the wife who was more apt to become Christian, and the paterfamilias was the one who had to be dragged along.
This makes sense, I think, from a contextual perspective, because the paterfamilias and men in the family in general are going to be already engaged in the public political sphere. It's a lot more risky, I would think, up until a certain point, for them to be openly professing an attachment to Christianity. And so while they may be talking about it at home, they're potentially not talking about it in public just for reasons of safety up until there's a threshold point for that. But yeah, I can see how the political scape might be a preventative factor for open engagement.
Steve here. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like Scott Rank's History Unplugged podcast and other great podcasts. Go to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more. And here is a quick word from our sponsors. I always thought it was interesting, though, that in a lot of other cultural contexts, it was oftentimes the women of the family who were the ones who would be more conservative in the way of like culture and religion. And the men would oftentimes be the early adopters of a new culture. But then again, that's usually when the men are going to another place and being exposed, like say in Anglo-Saxon Britain, when they would go by themselves and not bring their families. It's kind of an interesting dynamic when something new, like a religion, bubbles up through a culture, how it transmits.
Yeah, I mean, I could be wrong about this because this isn't my area of expertise. I'm just sort of remembering my my undergraduate days. Wasn't there some sort of line of thought that maybe with Christianity, one of the reasons why women seem to be so involved, at least at these sorts of early stages, is because a lot of the meetings had to take place within the home, rather than in a public space, because it was something that was obviously still in its very nascent stages, and it was obviously something that the Romans viewed with suspicion at various times, and so they tended to have meetings, in people's houses, whereas normally, I suppose, if you're looking at the kind of religion that predominates in this world, it's all about being in the public. It's mostly about being in the public space or being quite open about, your religious beliefs and practices.
I think this is definitely part of it. And I think the other factor to keep in mind is that there is, in this period of history, the inequality between genders is quite substantial. And Christianity is actually offering an updated and more equal perspective on the relationship that men and women would engage in with each other. So this sense in which they're all part of this broader thinking, and submission to one is also submission to the other. And although those texts may have been interpreted differently over time, there is a sense that women might have a greater position of respect in a particular way in a Christian perspective early on, which we might not see a flow-on effect necessarily historically all the time.
But in those early stages, yeah. So I did love the fact that Lygia was dressed in a blue mantle and a white dress in the very last scene. Very merry.
In the early times, women too, they would have had full membership. Maybe they wouldn't become elders, but most other people didn't become elders as well. But in any other way, they were full members of the organization.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that's something I think you can that's something I feel like the film has kind of got right, in the sense that Lygia and her mother, are quite involved in the conversations and the sort of congregation scene, I don't know what else to call it.
One other thing that I'd love to hear what an expert has to say is in the scenes where they're finally they're setting the animals off against the Christians in the arena. Is there historical records of that's what the animals would actually do? Like, would a lion actually just run out and go crazy attacking?
No,
that doesn't seem like something they do.
No. It makes me sad to think about this. I mean, obviously we've got the anachronistic use of what seems to be the Colosseum.
Yeah,
that's the
true.
first issue. Yeah.
Yeah. Whilst the Romans did like to use exotic animals in the arena, and they did like to stage, interesting spectacles and interesting ways of executing people, from what we can see in written sources, it seems like animals like lions don't really respond very well to massive amounts of cheering crowds. It tends to spook them.
Well, yeah, and it also seems to be, it's partly more of a popular cultural association that they're using animals against Christians as well. So, and we know that if you want an animal to perform in this way, you have to treat it pretty badly and not feed it. And even the animals that are used in this film were difficult to train because they didn't want to run at people. They were circus animals that were on loan from various circuses throughout Europe, and they were difficult to train. And also they were filming those scenes in a very hot summer. Those animals didn't want to be out in the sun either, understandably. You're a big cat. It's daytime. It's time for sleeping.
Yeah.
So even just thinking about the treatment of the animals in this film, it makes me sad. But also I think about, like, well, how does that knowledge translate to an understanding of the ancient world? And I can't imagine it would be any easier to attempt to get an animal to perform in that kind of way for a spectacle. It's much more likely that you'll just have gladiators going in and doing the work. They know they get paid. They understand the social conditions.
Yeah. There is now, or at least the last time I was there, Dr. G, you were there more recently, so you can perhaps update me on this. I believe there is a cross in the Colosseum. Is that still there?
Yeah, there is. Yeah.
Yeah. Which there's still a bit of debate about, because whilst it probably happened that at some point a Christian ended up in the Colosseum, not in the reign of Nero, obviously, because the Colosseum didn't exist. It was built over one of Nero's architectural innovations for his brand new golden house after the fire of Rome. I don't believe we've got any firm evidence that Christians were in fact killed in the Colosseum.
We don't. And we have a really long history of Catholicism in Rome as well, which starts to double over with the ancient buildings that are left behind. I know this is going to get way off topic, but there was a proposal by a pope at some point to repurpose the Colosseum as a church and to take that central area and turn it into an interior for worship, which to my mind is just a fascinating trajectory from the way in which Christianity is navigated in that very early period of Roman history and Christianity to where it is in these films and then where it is throughout the Renaissance, et cetera, et cetera.
I mean, in terms of what is actually happening to the Christians in this film, though, there is some basis for that in terms of what's actually going on in the arena. If I'm going to just quote this directly from Tacitus because he sums it up pretty well. He says that what Nero does to them to punish them, supposedly setting the fire, and everyone's willing to go along with it because of their hatred of the human race, and I'm quoting Tacitus there, they were covered with wild beast skins and torn to death by dogs, or they were fastened on crosses and when daylight failed, were burned to serve as lamps by night. So that's a pretty typical Roman punishment. They kind of like the eye for an eye kind of way of thinking. And so to burn someone who's accused of setting a fire seems like poetic justice in the Roman mind.
Is there anything else you want to touch on?
Going to drag the Vestal Virgins into this.
Yes, the Vestal Virgin. Such a minor role, but such a major one for you.
So important. Well, first of all, there appears to be 7, so I'm a little bit concerned. So it seems that the Vestal Virgins have been upgraded slightly from being priestesses that worship Vesta. Vesta is the goddess that looks after the communal hearth, which represents the fire of the city itself, and is thought to represent the safety of the city. They're very much connected with the emperor in this imperial period. Yet what we see in this film is Vestal Virgins basically acting as announcers at events.
They
They
sort of MCs.
I bring out my MC, the one woman who's allowed to talk in public besides the empress. I give you the chief Vestal. She makes announcements at the Triumph. She also makes announcements at the arena, assuming that we don't really know what this arena is or which one it might be. But this is a very weird role for them to play, to be honest. We know that they're one of the privileged groups for seating at games. So they have a special spot where they can watch, which is cornered off from the rest of the population. But there's no evidence anywhere that I have come across that would suggest that they act as announcers at these kinds of events in any capacity. So to me, this is a fascinating moment of reception to have this transformation of a public priesthood into the MC announcer, if you like.
Now the MCs are the double Vs.
So overall, how would you rank this movie with some of the other great movies of that time period?
Look, I think personally, because of Peter Ustinov, I find this a really enjoyable movie. I mean, my favorite scene, definitely, and one I always show to my classes whenever we're doing the Julia Claudians, is when Nero receives news of Petronius' death, and he says, "Did you lead us? Quick, the weeping vase."
Oh, yes.
And captures one tear for him and one tear for me. Now seal it and hold it for posterity about how Nero wept for the death of his friend.
I'm actually really fascinated by this. I did make a note about this one. I was like, is there any historical evidence for something like this? It's gloriously over the top. But it
reminds me of Harry Potter now, but that's obviously not what it was at the time. No, I love Peter Ustinov's interpretation of Nero, even though it is buying into the worst stereotypes of Nero as a tyrant, of Nero as, every enemy of America at the time. I think he does a fantastic job. And I think that as you said earlier, Dr. G, I think that he does breathe life into the script. In a way that I think the other actors are more typically of their time and of this particular epic medium, and they seem a little bit stiffer. So I think Nero and Papaya, to be fair, that couple, I think they're fantastic in their roles. What did you think, Steve?
Yeah. I thought that's what at first, when Peter Ustinov, when you first see him, it's like, oh man, this is really over the top. But then once it gets rolling, like you believe it. And he is definitely the shining star of the movie.
Yeah.
I think,
Dr. G?
I feel like if you had anybody else in that role, this film would not be one that we would want to talk about. Because if this role is played in a wooden way, or in that sort of stiffness that we see coming through some of the other actors, it just wouldn't hold up. I mean, you wouldn't be able to believe in Nero. And I think in order for you to get into a lot of the stuff that's happening in this film, it really does generate your sympathy for the Christian parallel story that's running through this. Being like, okay, well, you're clearly being targeted in this moment by somebody who is insane, but is able to rationalize their insanity.
And it is interesting because Nero actually he only became sort of a more major focus from the 1925 version of this movie, which was made under Mussolini, actually. Before that, Petronius really was the focal character. But Nero becomes more major. Yeah.
Yeah. Petronius has a lot to offer, I think. And
yes.
And I think the actor has done a serviceable job with Petronius.
That's true. Yeah. That's true.
But he's not stealing any scenes either, really.
I think he's meant to be kind of subtle, and like some of the stuff that he says, it's really subtle. Like when when Nero first floats the plan of, maybe I have to set a real city alight to be able to appreciate what it would have been like to see Troy burn. And Petronius has that line where he says, "Oh, that would be taking art for art's sake too far," which is a really interesting nod to MGM's Latin motto about art for art's sake. So there's a lot of subtlety, I think, in Petronius. You're right that you don't that sometimes gets overshadowed by Ustinov, but really serves the movie well.
I think that actually leads into what might be my final question about this film, which is the special effects relating to fire. How much did they actually burn, and how dangerous was it? And were they doing overlaid scenes? Like, how was that executed? I'm really curious about the technical aspects of that, because a lot of that fire looks real to me, and how that is done is I'm really quite curious about.
Well, it's really interesting because being that the fire is obviously often a big set piece, no matter what version you're looking at, it's kind of part of the appeal of Quo Vadis, I think, is the fact that it's quite easily adapted, and it's got these big set pieces like the fire and the crucifixion of St. Peter and the treatment of the Christians and all that kind of stuff. But there's rarely any focus on the aftermath of the fire. Like, it just sort of happens, and then you go straight to dealing with the Christians. Even in the novel, I don't think they really dwelt very much on the destruction that's caused. And the historical fire was incredibly damaging as far as we can tell. Burnt down a huge amount of the city.
Yeah,
it certainly did.
Those scenes where where Marcus Vinicius goes to try and get Lygia, those are just amazing, with the burning buildings falling into the street. Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors.
Yeah, it's crazy. Yeah, but yet afterwards you just sort of go back to the Christian storyline, and there's just like nothing said really about the damage to the fire, and none of the no major character dies during the fire, which is interesting.
Well, they're all in Antium, aren't they? I mean, they've gone south.
True. But like even with with Lygia and her family, they all come through okay. Yeah, they're in the city, but they're fine.
Well, I mean, but they have to survive for the storyline, don't they? I mean, because they have to go through that whole execution process.
I mean, I think the thing about Quo Vadis is it took what was a very highly popular novel, which had been adopted, a number of times with mixed success, and then it sort of kicks off the 1950s with a very successful Roman versus Christians toga epic, and Hollywood is generally fairly conservative in the way that it likes to make films, in the sense that they're like, oh, wow, that formula worked. Let's do it again, but just tweak it slightly so that we can continue to cash in on what it was that worked for that film. So I think Quo Vadis definitely contributes to the numerous films we get that have a similar sort of focus throughout this decade.
Well, I had a great time with this. I think there's probably a lot more we could get into, but I think that we really covered the gist of this movie very well.
For a 3-hour movie.
In about an hour.
I think we did pretty well. Yeah. Yeah, I think at the end of the day, I think you can't really appreciate the complexity of this film, even though it seems like a very straightforward toga epic. You have to look at the backstory of not just the historical sources that it's based on, but you have to look at the novel. You have to look at toga plays. If you want to, there's a lot of interesting stuff about the previous films, like the 1913 and the 1925 versions. And then recently in 2001, they just made a Polish version of this film. To really appreciate it, you have to look at it in all the context. And then you have to look at the impact of World War II, what were the movie businesses going through, the Cold War, the HUAC hearings and the investigations into communism in Hollywood. There's just so much that goes into this film that could come across, I think, as a very superficial movie if you just watch the movie itself. But it's actually, I think, a bit of a catch-all for a lot of things that were going on at the time.
Yeah, I think that it did well, even if you compare it to some of the modern movies that have the sword and sandals epics of the 2000s, like Noah with Russell Crowe. It all got so muddled with the narrative. Like they tried too hard, where I think they did a very concise story that took 3 hours, but it was very concise.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. By compressing the story, it might have changed the focus a little bit, but it still is something that an audience can very easily understand. Dr. G, your final thoughts?
So I haven't spent much time with this film. I've seen it once. And my lingering impression is the sense in which Rome is clearly being positioned as something terrible in almost every respect. There is a real backlash against militarization, which is completely understandable, given that this is just post-World War II. There's a complete rejection of fascism through the symbols that are connected with the Roman imperial system, and that we see that flow on through to Mussolini. There is a rejection of Nazism through those triumphal scenes where you see the recollections to previous films and the clear signaling of Nazi Germany through hand gesture. And you can see the way in which the building narrative of the Christian outlook, which already underpins the American psyche, is being reinforced as the way forward to rebuild what people understand to be a broken world in this moment. And I think this is something that it's going to be, I'm trying to get into the mindset of the audience who would have gone and seen this in that moment, and the sense of comfort that you would take away from that this is about building a world which is based on forgiveness and love and not violence.
Yeah.
And being hugely reassured about that. Leaving the cinema and being like, yes, that is the world that we fought for, but also it's the world that we now have to try and bring to life.
Yeah, and I think that's, in a sense, what this movie is all about is actually captured very much in the little voiceover at the very beginning, which I'm going to quote if that's okay, where they say, "Imperial Rome is the center of the empire, undisputed master of the world. But with this power, inevitably comes corruption. No man is sure of his life. The individual is at the mercy of the state. Murder replaces justice. Rulers of conquered nations surrender their helpless subjects to bondage. High and low alike become Roman slaves and Roman hostages. There is no escape from the whip and the sword." And then comes in the "but only Christianity has the power to challenge this. They would spread their gospel of love and redemption. And soon," which is kind of weird given that we're talking about 64 AD at this point in time, soon, apparently, Christianity is going to topple the Roman eagle, which, of course, is not remotely true.
And I think I think
America of the 1950s, this is the Cold War rhetoric,
And I love that moment where this leads me to this point where Marcus Vinicius has his moment where he says to Lygia, "Will you give me the greatest triumph a man could ever have? Will you be my wife?"
That also speaks to the time that time period, that really late 40s when they're filming it. and very early 50s, where the United States doesn't really know where it stands. And a lot of like the rah-rah militarism that kicks in later, especially with films with John Wayne films, just it's not in the American psyche. And you have Americans, it's probably similar in other countries too, where soldiers who fought in World War II are starting to get called back up again to fight in the Korean War, and they're not particularly happy about that.
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah. No, I mean, that's the thing. Like, it's in 1947 that President Truman sets up that dichotomy, freedom versus tyranny in the world. And then it's not long after that obviously you see, China falling to communism, the Korean War starts. So whilst I'm speaking tongue in cheek in terms of the rhetoric used about Rome, I do understand that people would have felt potentially a real threat from communism at that point in time, particularly given the government propaganda surrounding communism, and given that they've just seen, the 1947 was when they started the investigations into Hollywood itself in terms of communist propaganda. And, as I said, Robert Taylor was part of that. They would have seen these people held up and as secret communist agents trying to sneak communist propaganda into movies. The hysteria that was being drummed up at this time, I think, for a lot of people would have meant that you did feel a need for the comfort that your values and your way of life is what's going to prevail.
It also makes you think about that initial quote that Christianity, obviously around the time of Constantine, has to square the circle, so to speak, that it's becoming the state religion of Rome, not officially at that point, a little bit later, but it has to embed itself into what Rome is. So it goes all that time of fighting against Rome, and then it becomes Rome.
Yeah, and I think that Quo Vadis will actually continue to be an endlessly popular story to adapt, because Nero and the Rome of this story so easily slot into representing whoever is oppressing someone at that point in time. So it's readily adaptable. And I think that's because if you go back to the novel, that's essentially what Sienkiewicz was writing about. And so that, therefore, this story will always be reused, a little bit like, Spartacus will always be reused as the hero, the underdog, fighting against oppression. Any story like that, which feeds into an oppression storyline where someone's dominant and someone's being dominated, will be reused to tell the story of modern politics.
Yeah, it's a great tableau to use.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's easy to use. That's the thing. It's easy to use.
Well, I'm sure we could all say one more thing, but we'd probably be running up to about the runtime of Quo Vadis.
Well, thank you so much for having us on.
Yeah, it was. This is a great conversation about a really interesting movie. I think everybody should definitely go out and see it, and it's available on all the usual streaming services. You can very easily find it.
Yes, you shan't be disappointed.
No.
Even just for Nero, it's definitely worthwhile.
Definitely.